Hello and welcome to Archives and Records Simplified. So a quick word about these videos. These videos are aimed at people looking for basic knowledge about archives and records, and this could honestly apply to anyone. You may be a student that's looking to undertake the Archivist and Records Management course. You may be a librarian that's been asked to work with some archives. You might be a digitisation manager who wants to know more about the collections and the material they're digitising, or you may just have a general interest in archives and records. This is a topic which I think will intersect with many industries, and the idea of these videos is to be as open and as usable for as many people as possible. The vast majority of videos in this channel will be less than 15 minutes, but some of them will get more complex in certain parts. Sources and further reading will always be posted at the end of the video. And also, I would just like to add, if you have any questions, feel free to put it in the comments below. Or if you have any requests, if there's any topics you would like me to make another short video about, please also feel more than free to mention them. I'd be delighted to learn. A quick word about me. I'm an archivist based in London. You can look at my LinkedIn profile here. And lastly, I apologise for my thick accent. I realise if you're not Scottish, you might be struggling a little bit to understand me. Therefore, there'll be a full transcript posted in the description at the end of each video. Okay, I hope you enjoyed the channel and you find this of use. Also, if you find these videos useful, I would be really grateful if you could like and subscribe and possibly hit the bell button as well. Thanks. Okay, so this video is about the most common skills needed by archivists based on roughly 100 job descriptions from about 2018. So a little bit of context. This study was done in 2018 by myself when, quite frankly, I had too much time on my hands. The job I was in at that point in time had a really generous tea breaks, and this gave me the opportunity to undertake some private research. I was also looking at a few additional training courses at this point in time, and I just wanted to see if the money and time I'd be putting into them would be well spent. And I honestly felt the best way to do this was just simply to look at job descriptions and track what was coming up the most often. So a quick overview. So in sum, I looked at about 100 jobs and I made a note of the skills and experiences that were being asked for the most. The vast majority of these jobs are in the UK, but I did look at a few outside of the UK just for some more depth. I primarily looked at archivist and assistant archivist roles, so I didn't look too much at archives assistant, reading room positions, and on another scale, I didn't go into the more senior positions, such as the head of special collections, for example. Lastly, all of these roles were posted in round about 2018. A few may have been posted, initially put online, maybe late 2017, but they're almost, I think every role I looked at would be within the last 3 years or so. Okay, so also just a few disclaimers and things to mention before I reveal which skills came up the most. First of all, this was a largely individual project, and other than some minor input from my girlfriend at the time, it did not receive too much proofreading. I also didn't distinguish too much between essential and desirable criteria, which is actually quite important in some areas, and when I'm going through the skills, I'll explain where maybe this is more of a factor. And I also tended to pay less attention to the softer skills such as attention to detail and communication skills, etc. These actually are, I mean, that's not to downplay these skills, these are really important. It's just I had a tendency to look at the more vocational skills that you could maybe do a course in. I also didn't count roles that required a postgraduate qualification, as quite frankly, this was in the vast majority, if not all roles. Also, I was maybe slightly biased towards certain skills that I maybe didn't have at that time, although I did look at it quite generally. I obviously do have a master's in archives and records management, so that wasn't something I noted as much when it came up. But to be honest with you, if I included that in the research, it would be top of the list because I think it would be almost 99.9% of archivist roles asked for that qualification. Also, maybe just as well, some job descriptions can often lack detail and use vague terms. So overall, I treat this as a snapshot. I think it's really good guidance. I don't think it's, I wouldn't say that this is empiric or super accurate in some areas, but I do think it gives a really useful snapshot of what some employers in the archives sector are looking for. Okay, so here's a list of all the skills that I tagged in the order that they came up the most. So don't worry, I'm not going to go through each one of these individually, but in some, subject knowledge, the first one on the list, was the most common skill that I found. So that came up the most times throughout those 100 or so job descriptions. And knowledge of the Dewey Decimal System was the least one. I think that came up for one role, which was combined between library work and archives work. So I'm going to concentrate a little bit on the top 4 skills in particular and go into a bit more detail about what they are. So the first category that was on that list was subject knowledge, and this came up in about a third of all jobs. And by subject knowledge, I'm referring to knowledge about a specific sector or topic. I realise this is quite vague. Essentially, some jobs will request that you have some knowledge about the subject of the archives you're working on. And in fact, if you think about the archive sector, it's not really a sector on its own. It's a sector that really intersects other sectors, such as medical archives, legal archives, art archives, example. And often, many of these institutions will ask for someone with a knowledge or experience of these subjects. So, for example, I once interviewed for a position where some knowledge of musical information, audio records, was required. Sometimes it might be knowledge of the art sector, it might be knowledge of medicine, or even law. There was a position at Oxford, I think, a couple of months ago, where they were looking for someone with a background in science, for example. It is hard to train for this because it's so non-specific in general, and I was thinking of breaking this category down into further subcategories to see which was the most common. The good news is that this was often more of a desirable criteria than an essential criteria. But I would say in the more competitive roles, that can be a huge factor. But the other bit of good news I would say is that it's not always necessarily the case that you would need to be an expert in these subjects, like such as have a PhD in biology. Sometimes it can just be being able to demonstrate a basic interest or knowledge, which is completely fair. And sometimes when preparing for roles, sometimes I will maybe look in future learn and see if there's maybe a couple. The second category, which is probably a bit easier to define and will probably seem a bit familiar to you, is digital preservation or even digital skills. I think digital skills was more the definition I used at the time. This came up in about a quarter of all roles I looked at, and it could vary from being a digital preservation role specifically, or maybe a role where digital work was a minor part of the job. Overall, I would say that this is a growing field, and although this study is less than 2 years old, I would not be surprised if this category has increased a little bit in that time. Digital skills are now becoming a key part of training courses and the sector in general. And the third one on the list is what I would call cataloguing, or sometimes experience of complex cataloguing, which is basically cataloguing complex collections. This accounted for about circa 20% of the roles I found, and is probably one of the core skills an archivist can pick up. Essentially, this is experience cataloguing archival collections. The more experience you get, the better, and having a diversity of experience is also really useful as well. You'll find that some of the archivist postgraduate courses usually include a working placement of some type, which is really recommended. And what I'd also say is if you're looking to volunteer or just some extra work on the side, if you can get something with a sort of cataloguing focus, that might be really useful for you. Especially if you're using standards such as ICIG, for example. And then lastly, there's what I sort of loosely call outreach. This is a bit broad, but generally refers to promoting a collection or archive generally. I personally really enjoy outreach, and I'm glad whenever I get the chance to do it. And I don't think this is at all surprising. I think archives are increasingly thinking about how they can raise more funds and enhance interest in their collections. This category may include experience using social media platforms, organising events, or approaching people in groups, or maybe even working with very specific groups if a certain catalogue or collection relates to them. So a few other observations I think are worth pointing out. Calm Axial is by far the most common cataloging software on the market. So if anyone watching this video is familiar with cataloging softwares, you know that there's a few. There's Archivist, there's Archivist Toolkit, there's AdLib. Well, Calm Axial came up more commonly than any other cataloging software. If you get the opportunity to use that in a voluntary role or something, I personally would recommend that you take it. ISAG is also very common and almost always in the essential requirements area. Unlike several of the top 4 skills, which can sometimes be a desirable option. In fact, I would personally say that if I'd only considered the essential criteria, then ISAG, maybe along with knowledge of legislation perhaps, may have actually been the most common skill. The other observation is that roles in higher education institutions accounted for about a quarter of all jobs. Universities tended to be one of the biggest hirers in the sectors, one of the biggest employers in the sector, and many wanted some knowledge of what it was like to work in an academic environment. So just again, if you're thinking about doing some voluntary work or getting some extra experience, it might be worth contacting universities and seeing if you can volunteer there for a bit. It's just a thought. Lastly, although I didn't look too much into senior roles, a couple of the ones I did come across maybe included archivist roles where there was some sort of minor management responsibility. And if you are thinking a bit more about senior or management roles, which is something I'm personally doing, then these roles often ask for someone with experience of fundraising. That might include funding applications, budget management skills, people skills, including managing people below you, which might also include managing volunteers, and stakeholder management, which might include working with donors or even more senior managers in an institution too. If you work in a sort of small archive, or maybe even a small university, if it's one of the smaller universities, you might find that you're actually in very common contact with one of the main directors. I previously worked at Oxford, and I always remember that there were several people between me and the director of the library, but then I also worked at a smaller institution called Liverpool Hope University, and I think the director of that library was simply my line manager's line manager. So it varies, and in smaller roles that can be a really valuable skill to have and demonstrate. Okay, so this research isn't published anywhere yet, albeit I may try and make an article out of it someday. So there's not really too much I can give you in terms of references, in terms of what I've done here. That said, if this is something you want to know more about, then please feel free to email me on the email addresses I've posted on this slide. I'd be happy to send my raw research. It's more than possible that some of my interpretations could be a bit better, and certainly it might benefit from another pair of eyes, and I'd be happy to do a second video if that's the case. Beyond that, I've added some archivist job profiles online, which often gives a useful list of the sort of key skills you often need. And yeah, so I hope you find this useful, and please let me know if you have any questions. I would be also interested in any follow-up suggestions. I may consider a similar video or study on either digital preservation or records management specific roles. Okay, thanks again. And if you find these videos useful, I would be very grateful if you could like and subscribe, and possibly hit the bell button as well. I'm hoping to do a lot more of these videos in the coming months and year, and liking, subscribing and hitting the bell button will make it more likely that you'll see updates in your feed.